how QTP manages such objects. I am going to open a simple notepad. I open a notepad now. So I have opened a notepad. Now this notepad, I am trying to add this object to the repository. This notepad object, I am trying to add it to the repository. Watch it carefully. Feel free to intervene in case if you have any clarification or if you have doubt. Now I am adding this object. Add objects to local. Using this, I am adding that notepad object. I have selected that add object to local and placed my hand on the window top. Untitled notepad, I place my hand, I click on it. As I click, I'll get the object selection window. In object selection window, since it is a notepad that is window level, there is a possibility of lot of child objects. He will ask me a question, what are all the objects that you want to add? That is a filter option. In my case, I want to add only the selected object. This window appears only if that object has a child objects. Otherwise, it doesn't appear. Now, I go with selected object only. There is no descendants. I say OK. Now, the object is added to the repository. You can see now it has got added to the repository with the same 4 properties. These 4 properties are nothing but properties defined in the mandatory properties that we have just seen before. Now I try to highlight this object, highlight in the application. I click on it. You can see now it is getting highlighted. It is visible to you. There was a blink. I don't know whether you have noticed that blink or not. So he is able to highlight that object in the application. Right? So he is now able to recognize that object. So next thing is, what happens, what if I have one more notepad added to the screen? So what is the position of QTP or how QTP recognizes the object if I add one more object to that screen? Now I added 2 notepads. One notepad on which we have recorded, there is another notepad. What will happen if I try to highlight? So the 4 properties that you seen here in the repository, do you agree now these 4 properties are going to be same for both the notepads? How many people are agreeing to this? The 4 properties, whatever I have defined here, is same for both the notepads. How many people are agreeing to this? Raise your hand. Perfect. Now I highlight this now. You can now see that he is coming up with the error message. I am highlighting. I clicked on highlight button. He says test object description is not unique. More than one object in the application matches the description. Because of this, he is not able to recognize the object. That's good. Fine. Now what I will do is, in the same notepad, I'll try to rename that object, one of the object. I'll try to rename one of the object. I'll go to second notepad. I save as, say, QTP online. I've saved it as that file with this name. Now you and me know these 2 notepads are different. You and me know these 2 notepads are different, but as per QTP, if I try to highlight it, he's still coming up with the same error message, right? The reason for that is still the 4 properties that you see. I try to spy on the second object. I am spying on the second notepad. In this second notepad, let us see now the four properties that he has used. Regular expression window title. We don't have to know the meaning. We are just trying to see the names that is appearing in this. Regular expression window title is notepad. Here also it is notepad. Regular expression window class is notepad. Again here it is notepad. Is one window is false. Excuse me. So is one window is false, there also it is false. Is child window is false, there is also false. So the four properties that we are seeing in the repository is same in both the notepads. So we have changed some property, and that property that we have changed is part of text. It is not part of the properties that has been recognized. Are you clear with this? The property that you are seeing is not that property that you have changed. We have saved the file with another name. The file that we have saved with another name is part of the text property, and the text property is not used for recognition. That is why when I highlight it, he is not able to highlight that object. Now, so you can see now he is coming up with an error message. What happens if I add that first object again? Now I am adding that first object again. See the difference how QTP now recognize that first object. I am selecting the add object to local. I am placing my hand on the first object notepad, placing my hand there. I am recognizing that object. You can see object selection screen, window. In this window, I now select filter screen, object, selected object only. Now you are able to see the difference now in the repository. The second notepad that has got added, you can now see that 5 properties are added, not only with 4. The previous notepad that you see, it is having only 4 properties used for recognition. Whereas in the second notepad, you notice that the 5 properties are now used. Right? The reason for this, what made QTP to now go with 5 properties instead of 4 properties? That is, again I am going back to the object identification. The object identification, I open the standard Windows add-in, window object now. In this window object, QTP always uses mandatory properties first. He tried to recognize the mandatory properties in the beginning, 4 properties. Now with this 4 properties, with 2 notepad opened, he failed to recognize, please note, he has failed to recognize that object uniquely. Right? Because at this moment, when you record, there are 2 notepads available. In both notepads, the first 4 properties that is defined in the mandatory properties is same. So QTP failed to recognize the object uniquely, because unless otherwise object is identified uniquely, QTP cannot replay back. So since he has failed, QTP has an option to choose assistive properties. When the mandatory property fails to recognize, QTP allows you to configure the assistive properties, and you can recognize the object using assistive properties. So when QTP trying to recognize the object with assistive properties, he is able to find that object unique. With a text notepad, that is untitled notepad, he is able to see that the object is unique. And since he is able to identify the object unique, QTP stops with recognizing the object using mandatory properties and assistive properties. Right? So that is the reason QTP now recognizes with text property as well. because at this moment we had two notepads. In the first instance when we recorded, at that time there was only one notepad. At that time assistive property was not required for him to recognize. The reason is with this 4 property he was able to recognize that object uniquely. In the next stage, when we have added the object, at that time there are two notepads open, and both the notepads, these 4 properties are same. So he cannot identify with the mandatory property alone. So he has taken the help of text property, and the text property untitled notepad makes that object unique. Now you can see now when I highlight it, he is able to highlight on that object. Right? So he is able to highlight it because now with this property set, this object is unique. Is this part clear? Is this part clear to you all? Right, good. Anybody else? Any questions? You can raise. There was a question asked. How about the same object changes its property in different sessions? I hope that answer has been given. Right? Is received? Yes, no. Fine. Perfect. Now, QTP, this is so very important. What we are trying to convey here is the application status, or the application, the way the application is seen by QTP decides how he recognizes that object. If I have multiple screen, I will recognize the object with that requirement. Now assume that there is a situation now, I'll open one more notepad. I'll open one more notepad. Now I have 3 notepads. So out of this 3 notepad, right, 2 notepads are having the same title as well. Untitled notepad, 2 notepads are having same title as well. Now if I try to recognize that object, or whatever the object that has already been added, if I try to highlight it, you can see now the second object also fails. The reason for this failure is, again there are 2 notepads having the text property also same. So now these 5 properties now is same for 2 objects, more than one object. So he is not able to identify it uniquely, so he fails. So now mandatory property has failed, assistive property also has failed. So during this time, how QTP recognizes the object? I am going to add this object now. Add object. I am adding the first object. I am adding the same object. In this object, I have selected the object that we have initially recorded. Object selection window shows that object. Filter screen shows that selected object only. I add now. Now you notice the difference. Notepad 3, you notice now ordinal identifier has got triggered now. Because mandatory property has failed, these 4 properties has failed. Assistive property also failed now to recognize the object. So he now left with no other option other than to go with ordinal identifier. So ordinal identifier is not, you are not allowed to configure the ordinal identifier. Ordinal identifier is a QTP now takes the control. He has given 2 options to you to configure. One, mandatory properties, another assistive properties. Unfortunately, these 2 properties failed to recognize the object uniquely at the time of recording. Since this has failed, but somehow QTP likes to recognize that object uniquely, he uses ordinal identifier. In ordinal identifier, there are 3 ways I can recognize the object. So first is how QTP recognizes the object. One uses mandatory properties by default. Two, on failure of mandatory properties to identify the object uniquely, QTP takes the help of assistive properties and tries to recognize the object. Third, on failure of assistive property, QTP uses the ordinal identifier. Ordinal identifier has location as one of the mode of recognition, second index, third creation time. These are all the three ways he recognizes the object using ordinal identifier. So now we are trying to learn what is location. That is what we are trying to learn now. Next is index. Creation time, we will see it when we are dealing with the browser. Right? Creation time is meant for the browser. Now I'll go back to my QTP. Now here you can see now the object is identified with location. Highlight the object. I am trying to highlight the object. When I highlight it, you can see now the object is selected. The first object is selected. What made QTP to recognize as 1? Location 1. I can edit it. Now I change this location to 0. What is this 0 means? If I try to make it as 0 and then highlight it, I am going to highlight again. You can now see that the first object is recognized, not the first in the x-axis. So if it is 1, the other object is recognized. I am making it as 1 now. I am changing it to 1 now manually and highlighting it. Now you can see that the second object is recognized. If I make it as 0, I am manually changing it to 0. There are two notepads with the same 5 properties having the same value. There are two notepads. QTP Online doesn't come into competition because for text property is different for it. So with these two notepads, 0 identifies the first notepad, 1 identifies the second notepad. Here I mean first is the one which is closest to the x-axis. What made QTP to recognize? Now location means, what QTP does is, location means whichever object is close to x and y axis, he assigns the value 0 to that object. So out of these two objects that you see in the screen, out of these two objects, he sees now the object that is now the first object that you see now is close to the x-axis. Since he is close to the x-axis, he is assigned with 0. The object that is now here is now assigned with 1. So if I move the first object to the right hand side, now if I try to highlight with the same 0, now you can see that he is now highlighting this object, not the one that is highlighted now. Now I'll just highlight it. I click on highlight now. I clicked on highlight. Now you can see the first object is 0 now, which was 1 before. So as per QTP, the location means the one who is close to x and y coordinates is assigned with 0. Here the x and y coordinates means from the desktop, The left hand side of the desktop, topmost corner of the desktop is 0, 0. Bottommost corner, right hand side, bottommost corner of the desktop is maximum. In my case, it is 1280 by 780 pixels. The left hand side topmost is 0, 0. X is 0, Y is 0. So the one which is having close to the x-axis is assigned with the 0. That is how location works. There is another called index. Now index 0 means out of these two objects, the object which is currently active out of these two objects, you know now the first object is active, that object is recognized as 0. Index means the object that is currently active is recognized as 0. Right? So what is then 1 means? Index 1, I am changing that index value, click on that configure value. I am just making it index as 1. When I change the index as 1, I highlight it. Now you can see that the second object is recognized. But now that object, the second object now has become active. Since he is active now, if I highlight it again, 1 means second active. If I highlight it again, he now toggles to the another object. So he is toggling now between this object and that object because the object that is now highlighted now is again active. The one which is active is 0 as per QTP standards. Index is the one which is currently active is 0. The next object is 1. So if I go to the next, if I again spy, you can see that the second object is highlighted. It is toggling. The object is toggling. So he is not able to keep it with the one object because the index, the way it works, the object which is currently active is considered as a 0. So these are all the two options available for all these objects by default. One is location, another is index. By default, QTP is configured to location. For all the web objects, by default, it is configured to index. You can change the way you want him to recognize. Right? So most of the applications, the object's location doesn't change much. So that is why he is keeping that location as option 0. The one who is closest to the x-axis is 0 in location. In index, the one who is currently active is 0. So this is about ordinal identifier. So the object identification uses So the object identification uses mandatory property, assistive property, ordinal property. It always tries to recognize the object using mandatory properties. When mandatory property fails to recognize the object uniquely, he tries to recognize using assistive properties. When assistive property also fails to recognize the object uniquely, he goes with ordinal identifier. Ordinal identifier, you are allowed to select either location or index. Location means the object which is closest to the x-axis is assigned with a value 0. For index, the object which is currently active is assigned with a value 0. There are questions now. If the two notepads has a different name, still QTP considered it as a unique object. The reason is the mandatory properties, regular expression window title, regular expression window class, is phone window, is child window, is this, these are all same now. The text property is the one which we have changed before. With the text property, QTP online is the changed property. With that text property, he is able to identify it uniquely. But after we open 3 notepads, In this 3 notepads that you see in the screen now, 2 notepads are having the same text. So assistive property also failed. Because of that, he has gone to the ordinal identifier.